My name is Linda, and I'm 28 years old. Christmas has always been my favorite time of year, filled with warm memories of family gatherings, laughter echoing through our old farmhouse, and the smell of my mom's famous apple pie filling every corner. But last Christmas, everything changed in a way I never saw coming. What started as a hopeful family reunion turned into the most devastating moment of my life when my own mother stood up at our dinner table and said words that shattered my heart into a million pieces. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that'll make you think twice about family dynamics. Trust me, what happened next will show you how one moment of truth can change everything forever. Growing up in Millbrook, Ohio, I always thought I had the perfect family. We were the kind of people who went to church on Sundays, had barbecues in the backyard, and took family photos every Christmas morning. My dad, Frank, worked at the local manufacturing plant for over 30 years, and my mom, Eleanor, stayed home to raise my younger brother, Dennis, and me. Dennis, who's 25 now, was always the golden child. Star athlete in high school, full scholarship to Ohio State, and now he's working as an engineer at a respected firm in Columbus. Me. Well, my path wasn't quite so straightforward. I married my college sweetheart, Mark, right after graduation, thinking we'd build this beautiful life together. For 6 years, I tried to be the perfect wife. I worked as a marketing coordinator at a small advertising firm, kept our apartment spotless, and planned elaborate dinner parties for Mark's coworkers. But behind closed doors, our marriage was falling apart. Mark had become distant, spending more time at work and less time talking to me. When I'd try to discuss our future, having kids, buying a house, he'd brush me off with promises that we'd talk later. Later never came. Then 8 months ago, I discovered text messages on his phone that revealed he'd been having an emotional affair with his coworker Sarah for over a year. When I confronted him, instead of remorse, I got anger. He blamed me for being too needy, too demanding, for not understanding the pressure he was under at work. I suggested marriage counseling, but Mark refused. He said I was being dramatic, that it wasn't even a real affair since nothing physical had happened. But I knew better. Those late-night conversations, the secret meetings for coffee, the way he lit up when she texted it, was all the intimacy that had disappeared from our marriage redirected to someone else. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I filed for divorce. The process was brutal. Mark fought me on everything from dividing our small savings account to who got the coffee maker we'd received as a wedding gift. By the time it was finalized, I was emotionally drained and financially struggling. I couldn't afford our apartment on my salary alone, so I made the difficult decision to move back to Millbrook temporarily while I got back on my feet. I found a small one-bedroom apartment above Henderson's Bakery on Main Street. It wasn't much, just 400 square feet of space that smelled perpetually of fresh bread and coffee, but it was mine. Mrs. Henderson, the 70-year-old owner, gave me a break on rent in exchange for helping with her books a few hours each week. It was humble, but it was honest work, and I was proud that I was surviving on my own. My family's reaction to my divorce was complicated. My parents had loved Mark, or at least the idea of him. He was charming, successful, and he fit their vision of what a good husband should be. When I told them about the divorce, there was no, "Are you okay?" or "What can we do to help?" Instead, there were questions about what I'd done wrong, suggestions that maybe I should have tried harder, hints that perhaps I was being too sensitive about the whole situation. Dennis had recently gotten engaged to Patricia, a brilliant woman finishing her residency to become a pediatrician. She came from a prominent family. Her father was a respected surgeon, and her mother was involved in all the right charitable organizations. Patricia was everything I wasn't, everything my family wished I could be. She was successful, composed, and most importantly, she was making Dennis look good. As Christmas approached, I found myself desperately hoping that the holiday would bring us closer together. Maybe being surrounded by family traditions and childhood memories would remind everyone that I was still the same Linda they'd loved before my life got complicated. I spent money I couldn't really afford on thoughtful gifts for everyone. For my dad, I found a vintage tool set at an antique shop that reminded me of the one his father had used. For my mom, I bought a beautiful hand-painted ornament from a local artist. For Dennis and Patricia, I chose an elegant picture frame, hoping they'd use it for their engagement photos. I even had exciting news to share. After months of interviews, I'd been offered a position as senior marketing coordinator at a growing firm in nearby Dayton. It meant a significant salary increase and the opportunity to move into a larger apartment. I thought surely this good news would help show my family that I was getting my life back on track, that the divorce hadn't defeated me. The week before Christmas, my mom called to finalize the dinner plans. She mentioned that she'd also invited my dad's sister Geraldine and her husband Roger along with their son Craig. Aunt Geraldine and Uncle Roger lived in Cincinnati, where Uncle Roger was a successful accountant and Aunt Geraldine worked in real estate. Their son Craig, who was 30, had just made partner at a prestigious law firm and was exactly the kind of son any parent would be proud of. She also mentioned that Patricia's parents, Dr. and Mrs. Thompson, would be joining us. This surprised me a little since they'd never been included in our family Christmas before, but I figured it made sense given the engagement. Still, it meant that dinner would be more formal than usual, more of a showcase than a simple family gathering. As I prepared for Christmas dinner, I felt a mixture of nervousness and hope. This was my chance to show everyone that I was doing well, that I was strong, that I was building a good life for myself despite the setbacks. I pressed my best dress, wrapped the gifts with care, and practiced in my mirror how I'd share my job news. Everything was going to be different this year. Everything was going to be better. Christmas morning arrived crisp and clear, with that perfect dusting of snow that makes everything look like a greeting card. I drove the familiar route to my childhood home, passing the elementary school, where I'd learned to read the park where Dennis and I used to sled every winter, and the church where we'd attended every Sunday for 18 years. Each landmark brought back memories of simpler times when family felt like a safe harbor instead of a place where I had to prove my worth. The house looked magnificent. Mom had outdone herself with the decorations this year. Garland wrapped around every pillar on the front porch, twinkling lights outlined the roofline, and a massive wreath hung on the red front door. Through the windows I could see the Christmas tree in the living room, decorated with the same ornaments we'd collected over the years, each one holding a memory. I took a deep breath, gathered my gifts from the back seat, and walked up the front steps. Before I could even knock, the door swung open, and there was Dennis looking polished and confident in his navy sweater and khakis. Behind him stood Patricia, absolutely stunning in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her dark hair was styled in perfect waves, and she wore subtle pearl earrings that caught the light beautifully. "Linda, you made it," Dennis said, pulling me into a hug that felt genuine but brief. "Patricia, you remember my sister Linda?" "Of course, so good to see you again," Patricia said with a smile that was warm but somehow didn't quite reach her eyes. "I love your dress. That color is so pretty on you." The compliment felt backhanded somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the slight emphasis on the word "that," as if she was surprised anything could look good on me. I pushed the thought away, determined to stay positive. Inside the house buzzed with activity. The dining room table had been expanded with all the extra leaves and covered with Mom's best china. The set that only came out for special occasions. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier, and the good silverware was laid out with military precision. This wasn't just Christmas dinner, this was a production. In the kitchen, Mom was orchestrating the meal like a conductor leading a symphony. She looked beautiful in her forest green dress, her graying hair styled in elegant waves. When she saw me, her face lit up with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "Linda, sweetheart, you look wonderful," she said, kissing my cheek, while somehow managing not to disturb her lipstick. "How was the drive? I was worried about the roads with all this snow." "It was fine, Mom. The roads are actually pretty clear. This all looks incredible. You've really outdone yourself." "Well, with the Thompsons coming, I wanted everything to be special. Dr. Thompson is such a distinguished man, and Mrs. Thompson is involved with the hospital auxiliary." I want them to feel welcome in our home." There it was, that subtle indication that this dinner was really about impressing Patricia's parents, not about celebrating Christmas with family. But I smiled and offered to help, only to be gently shooed away. "Oh no, dear, I have everything under control. Why don't you go say hello to everyone in the living room?" The living room was like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. Dad sat in his favorite armchair, deep in conversation with Dr. Thompson about the latest developments in minimally invasive surgery. Dr. Thompson was exactly what you'd expect from a successful surgeon: distinguished silver hair, confident posture, and the kind of authoritative voice that made you want to listen when he spoke. Uncle Roger and Aunt Geraldine were admiring the Christmas tree with Mrs. Thompson, a petite woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, who radiated the kind of quiet elegance that comes from a lifetime of country club membership and charity luncheons. She was asking about the antique ornaments, and Aunt Geraldine was sharing stories about our family traditions. And there was Craig standing by the fireplace with a glass of wine, looking every inch the successful lawyer in his expensive suit. At 30, he had the kind of confidence that comes from never having experienced real failure. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his questions about my life felt more like a deposition than casual conversation. "So, Linda, I heard you're living back in Millbrook now. How are you finding small-town life after being in the city?" "It's actually really nice," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "There's something comforting about being back where I grew up, and the pace is a little slower, which I'm appreciating right now." "I'm sure," he said with a knowing nod. "Sometimes we all need to take a step back and regroup. I imagine it's been a challenging year for you." The way he said challenging made it sound like a character flaw rather than a life circumstance. But before I could respond, Dennis appeared with Patricia, practically glowing as they announced they had something to share. "We've set a date for the wedding," Patricia said, extending her left hand to show off her engagement ring. It was stunning, a classic solitaire that caught the light beautifully. "June 15th, and we're planning to have the ceremony in Tuscany. Patricia's family has connections there, and we found this incredible villa that overlooks the countryside." The room erupted in congratulations and excited questions. Dr. Thompson beamed with pride as he described the venue. Mrs. Thompson pulled out her phone to show photos of the location, and my parents looked absolutely thrilled to be connected to such an elaborate celebration. "A destination wedding in Italy," Mom said, clasping her hands together. "How romantic, and how exciting for all of us to travel there together." I felt a little pang at the assumption that all of us would be able to afford such a trip, but I smiled and added my congratulations to the chorus. This was Dennis and Patricia's moment, and I genuinely wanted them to be happy. As the conversation continued, I found myself becoming quieter and quieter. Every topic seemed to highlight someone else's success or good fortune. Craig was buying a house in an upscale neighborhood in Cincinnati. Dr. Thompson had just been named department head at the hospital. Mrs. Thompson was chairing a fundraising gala that had already raised over $50,000 for children's cancer research. When there was finally a lull in the conversation, I took a deep breath and decided to share my news. "Actually, I have some exciting news too," I said, trying to match the enthusiasm in the room. "I've been offered a new position as senior marketing coordinator at a company in Dayton. It's a significant step up both in responsibility and salary." The response was polite but lukewarm. A few "that's nice" comments, a couple of nods, but nothing like the excitement that had greeted Dennis and Patricia's wedding announcement. The conversation quickly moved on to other topics, and I realized that my achievement didn't measure up to the standards of success being celebrated in this room. Dinner was called, and we all moved to the dining room, where Mom had created a feast that belonged in a magazine. The turkey was golden brown and perfectly carved. The side dishes were arranged artfully in her best serving bowls, and everything was garnished with fresh herbs and seasonal touches. It should have been a moment of family togetherness and gratitude, but instead, I felt like I was attending a performance where I hadn't been given the script. As we settled around the expanded dining table, I found myself seated between Aunt Geraldine and Mrs. Thompson, directly across from Craig and Patricia. Dennis sat at one end of the table next to Dad, while Mom took her place at the other end, perfectly positioned to orchestrate both the meal service and the conversation. The dinner conversation flowed like a carefully choreographed dance. Craig regaled us with stories from his law firm describing high-profile cases he couldn't name but could hint at impressively. His latest victory involved defending a major corporation against what he described as frivolous environmental claims, and Uncle Roger nodded approvingly at his son's success in protecting business interests. "The key is understanding that business drives the economy," Craig explained, cutting into his turkey with precise movements. "When you protect responsible corporations from excessive litigation, you're really protecting jobs and innovation." Dr. Thompson jumped in with his own perspective on frivolous lawsuits in the medical field, and soon the two professional men were engaged in the kind of serious discussion that made everyone else at the table feel like observers rather than participants. Dennis and Patricia seamlessly transitioned the conversation to their wedding planning, with Patricia describing the dress shopping experience she'd had in Chicago with her mother and future mother-in-law. Mrs. Thompson's eyes sparkled as she recounted the day, making it sound like a scene from a romantic movie. "We went to this boutique that specializes in designer gowns," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with the kind of pride that comes from being able to afford the best. Patricia looked absolutely stunning in everything she tried on, but when she put on this one particular dress, we all just knew. Even the saleswoman started crying. "It sounds magical," Mom said, and I could hear the wistfulness in her voice. She'd never had the experience of shopping for a wedding dress with me. My wedding had been planned quickly and on a budget, with a dress from a department store and a small ceremony in the church fellowship hall. "We're also planning the most wonderful honeymoon," Patricia continued. 2 weeks in Greece Island, hopping through the Cyclades. Dennis found this incredible itinerary that includes private yacht charters between some of the islands. The conversation painted a picture of a life I couldn't even imagine affording. Private yacht charters, designer wedding dresses, destination weddings in Italian villas. These weren't just different choices, they were different worlds, and I was increasingly aware that I didn't belong in this one. When Aunt Geraldine asked about my work, I tried again to share my excitement about the new job opportunity. "The company is really innovative," I explained. "They're doing some cutting-edge work in digital marketing, and they've been growing rapidly. The position would give me a chance to manage my own accounts and really develop my skills in a way I haven't been able to before." "That sounds nice, dear," Aunt Geraldine said, with the kind of polite interest you'd show for a child's art project. "Digital marketing, that's all very modern, isn't it? I can't keep up with all these computer things myself." Uncle Roger jumped in with what he probably thought was helpful advice. "The key is finding stability, Linda. These new companies, they can be here today and gone tomorrow. You want to look for established businesses with solid foundations. That's how you build a real career." "Roger's absolutely right," Dr. Thompson added. "In medicine, we always emphasize the importance of proven methods over experimental approaches. Sometimes the newest isn't necessarily the best." I felt my enthusiasm deflating like a punctured balloon. What had seemed like an exciting opportunity was being dismissed as risky and potentially foolish. I tried to explain that the company had been in business for 5 years and had an impressive client list, but the conversation had already moved on. Craig was describing his recent house hunting experience, and suddenly everyone was fascinated again. He'd found a beautiful colonial in an exclusive neighborhood, complete with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool. The price tag he mentioned casually was more than I'd ever hoped to make in 3 years. "The important thing," Craig said, "is getting into the right neighborhood. Property values, school districts, the kind of neighbors you want your future children to grow up around. You can't put a price on those things." "Absolutely," Mom agreed enthusiastically. "Environment is so important, especially when you're thinking about raising a family. You want to be around people who share your values, who are working toward the same goals." The implication hung in the air like smoke. The right kind of people, the right kind of neighborhood, the right kind of goals. By contrast, my apartment above a bakery in small-town Millbrook was clearly the wrong kind of everything. Dennis, perhaps sensing the tension, tried to bring me into the conversation. Linda's always been good with people, he said. She has this natural ability to connect with clients and understand what they need. That's probably why she's been successful in marketing. But even his attempt to include me felt patronizing somehow. It was the kind of compliment you'd give someone whose real achievements were too small to mention a participation trophy in conversational form. As the meal progressed, I noticed the way conversations would naturally flow around me rather than through me. When I'd start to contribute to a discussion, there would be polite attention for a moment. Then someone would smoothly redirect to a different topic or a different person. It wasn't obvious enough to call out, but it was consistent enough to be intentional. The worst part was watching my parents' reactions to everyone else's achievements versus their response to mine. When Craig talked about his house, Dad asked detailed questions about the neighborhood and the investment potential. When Patricia mentioned her residency, Mom wanted to know all about her specialty and her future practice plans. But when I tried to share details about my new job opportunity, their responses were perfunctory, almost distracted. I began to realize that this wasn't just a family dinner. It was an evaluation, and I was failing to meet the standards being set by everyone else at the table. My divorce wasn't just a personal setback, it was a family embarrassment. My temporary living situation wasn't just a practical solution, it was evidence of failure. My job prospects weren't exciting opportunities. They were desperate attempts to salvage a disappointing life. The Christmas dinner I'd hoped would be a celebration of family togetherness was turning into a showcase of everything I wasn't, everything I hadn't achieved, everything I couldn't afford. And the worst part was that I could see my parents' disappointment growing with each comparison, each subtle reminder of how far short I fell of their expectations. As dessert was being served, Mom's famous apple pie alongside Patricia's contribution of some elaborate French pastries from a high-end bakery in Columbus, the conversation took a turn that made my stomach clench with dread. Dr. Thompson, perhaps feeling the effects of the wine, became more philosophical about life choices and personal responsibility. "You know," he said, cutting into his slice of pie with the precision of a surgeon, "I've always believed that by the time you reach your late 20s, you should have a clear sense of direction. Life is about making good decisions consistently, not just hoping things will work out." Mrs. Thompson nodded in agreement. "We've always taught Patricia that choices have consequences. When you commit to something, whether it's a career path, a relationship, or a lifestyle, you have to see it through. Giving up when things get difficult isn't really an option." I felt the comment like a physical blow. While they weren't looking directly at me, the timing and content made it clear that my divorce was being discussed, even if indirectly. I took a sip of wine, hoping it would calm my nerves, but my hands were already shaking slightly. Craig, emboldened by the direction of the conversation, decided to share his own wisdom about commitment and perseverance. "In law, we see a lot of people who want easy solutions to complex problems," he said, his tone taking on the authoritative quality he probably used in courtrooms. "But the reality is that most problems in life can be solved if you're willing to work hard enough and make the necessary sacrifices. It's about personal accountability." Uncle Roger raised his glass in agreement. "That's exactly right. Your generation, Craig, understands the value of persistence. Too many people today want to quit the moment things get challenging instead of buckling down and doing the work." I could feel all eyes turning toward me, even though no one was being explicit about their target. The message was clear: I was the quitter at the table, the person who hadn't been willing to do the work, who had taken the easy way out when my marriage got difficult. "Sometimes," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, "the hardest thing isn't staying in a bad situation. Sometimes the hardest thing is having the courage to leave." The table fell silent for a moment, and I immediately regretted speaking up. Mom's face tightened with what looked like embarrassment, and Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dennis, perhaps trying to diffuse the tension, cleared his throat and attempted to change the subject. "Well, I think we should focus on positive things tonight. It's Christmas after all." But Mom, instead of taking his cue, decided this was the moment for what she probably thought was tough love. "Linda, sweetheart," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone parents use when they're about to deliver unwanted life advice. "I think what everyone is trying to say is that we care about you and we're concerned. You're 28 years old and you're living like a college student. You gave up on your marriage without really trying to fix it, and now you're making decisions based on fear instead of wisdom." The room felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the distant sound of neighbor children playing outside, and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "I didn't give up on my marriage," I said, my voice stronger now but still controlled. "I left a marriage where my husband was emotionally involved with another woman and refused to go to counseling. I left because staying would have meant accepting betrayal as normal." "But marriage is work, honey," Aunt Geraldine chimed in, clearly feeling empowered to share her opinion. "All marriages go through difficult periods. The question is whether you're willing to fight for something worth saving." "How do you know it wasn't worth saving?" I asked, feeling my composure starting to crack. "How do you know what went on behind closed doors in my marriage?" "Dr." Thompson set down his fork and looked at me with the kind of clinical assessment he probably used with difficult patients. "Linda, no one here is attacking you. We're trying to help you see that patterns of behavior tend to repeat themselves. If you don't learn from this experience and make different choices going forward, you're likely to find yourself in similar situations." The condescension in his voice was overwhelming. This man who had known me for exactly 3 hours was psychoanalyzing my life choices and predicting my future failures. And my family was nodding along as if his insights were profound wisdom instead of presumptuous judgment. "What kind of different choices?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Well," Mrs. Thompson said delicately, dabbing at her lips with her napkin, "perhaps being more realistic about your expectations. Not everyone is cut out for the kind of demanding career that takes you away from home responsibilities. Some people are happier in more traditional roles." Patricia, who had been silent during most of this exchange, finally spoke up. "I think what everyone means is that balance is important. I'm pursuing my medical career, but I also understand that family comes first. When Dennis and I get married, I'll make sure my career choices support our relationship goals, not compete with them." It was such a perfectly diplomatic non-answer that managed to simultaneously support everyone else's position, while making me look even more unreasonable for not having achieved the same balance. The worst part was that Patricia probably genuinely believed she was being helpful. Dennis, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, tried once more to redirect. "Maybe we should talk about something else. Linda's doing her best to rebuild her life, and she doesn't need us piling on with advice she didn't ask for." But Mom wasn't finished. She had clearly been building up to this moment for months, and nothing was going to stop her from having her say. "No, Dennis, I think this conversation needs to happen," she said, her voice taking on a tone of determined resolve. "We've all been walking on eggshells around Linda for months, pretending that everything is fine when it's not. Sometimes people need to hear the truth even when it's uncomfortable." I felt like I was watching a car accident in slow motion, helpless to stop what was about to happen but unable to look away. The worst part was that part of me had always known this moment was coming. The polite tolerance, the subtle disappointment, the careful way my family had been treating me since the divorce, it had all been building to this. "What truth is that, Mom?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know the answer. She looked around the table, gathering support from the assembled guests, and I saw several small nods of encouragement. Then she stood up, straightened her shoulders, and delivered the words that would change everything between us forever. Mom stood at the head of the table like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. The candlelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that made her expression look harder than I'd ever seen it. The room was completely silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of Christmas music playing somewhere in the neighborhood. "Well, Linda," she began, her voice carrying the kind of forced calm that comes before an explosion, Since you insist on challenging everyone and making excuses for your situation, I think it's time someone was completely honest with you." I felt my blood turn to ice water. Some part of me wanted to stand up and leave right then, to grab my coat and walk out before whatever was coming could destroy what was left of our family relationship. But I was frozen in place, trapped by years of conditioning that told me to sit still and take whatever my family decided to dish out. Mom looked around the table at each guest, as if seeking their permission for what she was about to do. Dr. and Mrs. Thompson sat perfectly still, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with the kind of interest people have when they're about to witness something dramatic. Craig leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression one of professional curiosity, as if he was observing a fascinating case study. Uncle Roger and Aunt Geraldine exchanged a meaningful look that suggested they'd been waiting for this moment. "The truth is," Mom continued, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each word, "we're ashamed of you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt my body recoil, as if she'd slapped me across the face. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "We've tried to be supportive," she went on, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the devastation she was causing. "We've tried to be understanding about your choices and your struggles. But enough is enough. You're 28 years old, Linda. You should be settled by now, building something meaningful with your life, instead of bouncing from one crisis to another like some kind of teenager." She gestured broadly, as if presenting evidence to a jury. "Look around this table. Look at what everyone else has accomplished. Craig is a successful attorney who owns his own home and contributes meaningfully to his community. Patricia is finishing her medical residency and will soon be saving children's lives. Dennis has built a stable career and is planning a beautiful future with a woman who shares his values and ambitions." Each comparison felt like another knife being twisted in my chest. But she wasn't finished. "And then there's you," she said, her voice taking on a tone of disappointed resignation. "Living in a tiny apartment above a bakery like some kind of college dropout. Working at jobs that barely pay enough to cover your basic expenses. Divorced because you couldn't be bothered to work on your marriage when it got difficult." The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, and the thundering of my heartbeat in my ears. I looked around the table, desperately hoping to see some sign of support, some indication that someone thought this was too far, too cruel. But what I saw was worse than active hostility. I saw nods of agreement. I saw faces that suggested this was difficult but necessary medicine. I saw people who thought my mother was finally saying what needed to be said. Dad cleared his throat softly, and for a moment, I hoped he was going to intervene to defend me, to remind everyone that I was his daughter and deserved better treatment than this. Instead, he said quietly, "Your mother's right, Linda. We've been worried about you for a long time, and we don't know how else to get through to you." Dennis looked deeply uncomfortable, his face flushed with embarrassment, but he remained silent. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand supportively, her expression one of sympathetic concern, as if she felt sorry for him having to witness his sister's public humiliation. "A failed marriage," Mom continued, clearly feeling emboldened by the support she was receiving. "Living like a teenager. No real career prospects at 28. Do you understand how embarrassing this is for us? Do you have any idea what people say when they ask about our children? I can brag about Dennis and his accomplishments, his beautiful fiancée, his promising future. But what am I supposed to say about you?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air like a toxic cloud. "Maybe if you heard it from all of us," she said, gesturing around the table, "you'd finally understand that the problem isn't everyone else. The problem is you. Your choices, your attitude, your unwillingness to take responsibility for your own life." That's when Dennis laughed. It started as a nervous chuckle, the kind of sound people make when they're uncomfortable and don't know how else to respond. But then it grew louder, more confident, as if he'd decided that joining in was easier than standing up for me. "Maybe Mom's right," he said, his voice carrying a note of cruel amusement. Maybe you need to hear this from people who care about you before you'll actually listen. His laughter was like gasoline on a fire. Suddenly, Craig was chuckling too, shaking his head, as if my situation was somehow amusing rather than tragic. Even Uncle Roger let out a small laugh, the kind that suggested he found my comeuppance long overdue. The sound of their laughter mixed with my mother's continued lecture created a surreal nightmare that felt like something out of a horror movie. These people who were supposed to love me, who were supposed to support me, were literally laughing at my pain. "Look at her face," Mom said, as if I wasn't sitting right there, as if I couldn't hear every word. "That's the look of someone who finally understands what everyone else has been thinking but was too polite to say." The complete cruelty of the moment was overwhelming. This wasn't tough love or concerned intervention. This was public humiliation performed for an audience designed to break me down completely. And the worst part was that it was working. I could feel my sense of self already fragile from the divorce and the struggles of the past year crumbling under the weight of their collective judgment. I looked around the table one more time, searching desperately for even one face that showed sympathy, one person who thought this had gone too far. But what I saw was a room full of people who had decided that I deserved this treatment, that I had brought this shame and humiliation on myself through my failures and poor choices. That's when something inside me shifted. The devastation was still there. The heartbreak was still overwhelming. But underneath it all, I felt something else beginning to build. It was small at first, just a tiny flame of indignation, but it was growing stronger with each passing second. They wanted to shame me for my choices, fine. But if we were going to air family secrets and pass judgment on each other's lives, then everyone at this table was about to discover that I had some truths of my own to share. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, feeling the weight of their stares and the echo of their laughter. Something was happening inside me that I'd never experienced before. All my life I'd been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and tried to make everyone comfortable. I'd swallowed criticism, accepted blame, and internalized every disappointed look my family had ever given me. But as I looked around that table at the faces of people who claimed to love me while actively destroying me, something crystalline and unbreakable formed in my chest. It was clarity, pure and simple. For the first time in my life, I could see my family clearly without the filters of obligation and wishful thinking. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. The laughter died, immediately replaced by surprised silence. Mom's confident expression faltered slightly, as if she was just beginning to realize that she might have pushed too far. "You're ashamed of me," I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly in the silent room. "Let me tell you what shame really looks like." I turned to face my mother directly, and I saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been fear. "Shame is a mother who had an affair when her daughter was 12 years old." I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Shame is thinking that a scared little girl didn't notice when Daddy started working late every night after he found those text messages on your phone." The color drained from Mom's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Dad's fork clattered against his plate as he dropped it, his mouth falling open in shock. "Linda," Mom whispered, but I wasn't finished. Not even close. "Shame is pretending for 16 years that everything was fine, that our family was perfect while you were sneaking around with your tennis instructor. Do you remember him? Mom Richard? The one who suddenly moved to Florida right after Dad confronted you." The silence in the room was different now. This wasn't the hushed anticipation of an audience waiting for entertainment. This was the suffocating quiet of people realizing they were about to witness something that would change everything permanently. I turned to my father, and my heart broke a little at the pain in his eyes. But I was beyond stopping now. "And shame Dad is drinking yourself to sleep every night for 2 years while pretending that everything was fine. Do you think I didn't smell the whiskey on your breath when you tucked me in? Do you think I didn't notice the bottles hidden in the garage behind the Christmas decorations?" Dad's face went ashen. He started to speak, but no words came out. But we don't talk about those things in this family, do we? I continued, my voice gaining power and momentum. We just pretend they didn't happen and focus on maintaining appearances. We keep family secrets and judge everyone else for not being perfect enough. I turned to Dennis, and for the first time since I'd started speaking, my voice softened slightly with genuine sadness. And Dennis, sweet Dennis, who everyone thinks is so perfect. Should I tell them about sophomore year of college? About Jennifer Morrison and how you begged me to help you cover up your cheating so Patricia would never find out? About how I lied to her face at that party when she asked me directly if I knew anything about rumors she'd heard? Dennis went completely white. Patricia's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with shock and something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Or should we talk about more recent history? I continued. Like last month when you called me crying because you were having doubts about the wedding, when you said you felt trapped by everyone's expectations and wondered if you were making the biggest mistake of your life. That's enough, Dennis said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I was far beyond listening to his protests. I looked around the table at our distinguished guests, these people who had sat here judging my life while presenting themselves as models of success and moral authority. You want to talk about shame, I said, addressing the room. Shame is sitting in someone else's home, eating their food and participating in the systematic destruction of their daughter. Shame is thinking that your success gives you the right to pass judgment on someone whose struggles you know nothing about. I turned back to my mother, who was now crying silently, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. But the deepest shame, Mom, the one that should keep you awake at night, is this: I divorced someone who betrayed me rather than live a lie. I chose honesty over convenience, truth over appearances. I chose to build a life based on integrity rather than pretense. And you're ashamed of me for that. My voice rose for the first time, carrying all the pain and anger and disappointment of 28 years. I'm rebuilding my life with courage and honesty, something this family wouldn't recognize if it slapped you in the face. I'm living in a small apartment because I'm paying my own way, instead of accepting money from people who think financial support gives them the right to control and humiliate me. I'm working at jobs that may not impress you, but at least I'm not building my success on lies and hidden secrets. I paused, looking around the table one more time at the faces of people who had thought they could break me down and rebuild me in their image. You're ashamed of me, I said, my voice now calm and steady and absolutely certain. Good. I'm proud to disappoint people who think that maintaining appearances is more important than maintaining integrity. I'm proud to be the family failure in a family that defines success as the ability to hide your dysfunction behind expensive clothes and impressive job titles. The silence that followed was complete and devastating. Mom's quiet crying was the only sound in the room, punctuated by the occasional sniffle from someone else who was finally processing the weight of what had just happened. If being honest about my struggles and choosing integrity over convenience makes you ashamed of me, I said, gathering my purse and coat from the chair behind me, then I'm proud to be everything you're ashamed of. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Mom's quiet crying exploded into full sobs, the kind of bone-deep weeping that comes when someone realizes they've destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. She clutched the edge of the table as if it was the only thing keeping her upright, her carefully styled hair falling forward to hide her face. "Linda, please," she gasped between sobs. "I didn't mean, I never wanted—" But her words were lost in the general chaos that had erupted around the table. Dad was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect, while simultaneously trying to process the public revelation of secrets he thought had been safely buried decades ago. Dennis had gone from white to red to white again, his eyes darting frantically between Patricia and me as he tried to calculate how much damage had been done to his carefully constructed image. Patricia sat perfectly still, her face a mask of controlled composure, but her hands were trembling slightly as she processed the implications of what she'd just learned about her fiancé. Craig, for once in his life, seemed to have nothing to say. His mouth opened and closed several times as if he was trying to formulate some kind of legal objection to what had just happened, but no words came out. Uncle Roger and Aunt Geraldine looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs, clearly regretting their participation in what had turned from family intervention into family destruction. Dr. and Mrs. Thompson were already pushing back from the table, their faces carefully neutral, but their body language screaming their desire to escape this situation as quickly as possible. This wasn't the kind of refined family dinner they'd expected, and they clearly wanted no part of whatever was happening next. "We should probably go," Dr. Thompson said quietly to his wife, his voice carrying the professional calm he probably used when delivering bad news to patients' families. "Yes," Mrs. Thompson agreed quickly, already reaching for her purse. "This seems like a family matter that should be handled privately." But I wasn't finished. Not yet. "No, please don't leave on my account," I said, my voice still calm but carrying an edge that made everyone freeze. "You were so eager to participate in judging my life choices. I'd hate for you to miss the conclusion of your evaluation." I turned back to my family, these people who had raised me and claimed to love me, while systematically undermining my confidence and self-worth for years. "You want to know what the real difference is between me and everyone else at this table?" I asked. "I'm the only one who's been brave enough to face the truth about my life and make the hard choices necessary to change it. Everyone else here is still hiding behind lies and pretenses and other people's money." Dad finally found his voice. "Linda, that's enough. You've made your point. There's no need to—" "To what, Dad?" I interrupted. "To tell the truth. To stop protecting everyone's feelings while they systematically destroy mine. To refuse to be the family scapegoat anymore." I looked directly at him, this man who had struggled with his own demons, but had never shown me the grace he was now asking for. "You want me to stop talking because you're embarrassed, because our guests are uncomfortable. Where was that concern for my comfort when everyone was taking turns explaining why my life was such a disappointment?" Eleanor was still crying, but now she was trying to speak through her tears. "I was trying to help you," she said, her voice broken and desperate. "I thought if you heard it from people who love you—" "People who love me don't humiliate me in front of strangers for entertainment," I said, cutting her off. "People who love me don't use family dinner as an opportunity to showcase my failures. People who love me support me when I'm rebuilding my life, not tear me down because my success doesn't look the way they think it should." I picked up my coat and purse, moving with deliberate calm toward the door. Behind me I could hear chairs scraping as people shifted uncomfortably, not sure whether to try to stop me or let me go. "Linda, wait!" Dennis called out, his voice cracking slightly. "We can fix this. We can talk about this." I turned back to look at my little brother, this person I'd protected and covered for and lied for throughout our entire lives, who had just participated in my public humiliation because it was easier than standing up for me. "Fix what exactly, Dennis?" I asked. "The fact that you showed me who you really are when it mattered? The fact that you sat there and laughed while our mother destroyed me? Or the fact that your fiancé now knows you're capable of cheating and lying when the pressure is on?" Patricia's face was still a careful mask, but I could see the gears turning behind her eyes as she processed not just what she'd learned about Dennis, but what she'd witnessed about the family she was about to marry into. "There's nothing to fix," I continued. "This is who we are. This is who we've always been. I'm just the first person in this family who's been brave enough to stop pretending otherwise." I walked toward the front door, and this time no one tried to stop me. Behind me I could hear the sound of chairs being pushed back as the Thompsons made their exit, followed by the awkward sounds of other guests gathering their things and making polite but hurried excuses. As I reached the front door, I turned back one last time to see my mother still crying at the head of the table, and my father sitting in stunned silence beside her. Dennis was trying to have a whispered conversation with Patricia, who was listening with the kind of clinical attention she probably used when taking patient histories. "For what it's worth," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the house, "I hope someday you'll understand that I didn't destroy this family tonight. I just stopped letting you use me to hold your dysfunction together." I opened the front door and walked out into the cold Christmas night, leaving behind the house where I'd grown up, and the family that had shaped me, and the illusions that had sustained me for 28 years. The snow was still falling gently, and the neighborhood was lit up with Christmas lights that made everything look magical and peaceful. I could hear the sound of laughter and music coming from other houses, families that were presumably having the kind of Christmas celebration I'd always thought mine was. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands shaking as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to wear off. Part of me felt devastated by what had just happened, by the final destruction of any pretense that my family was capable of loving me unconditionally. But underneath the sadness was something else, something I'd never felt before. It was relief. Pure, clean relief from the burden of trying to earn approval from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. Relief from the exhausting work of pretending that their treatment of me was normal or acceptable. Relief from the constant self-doubt and second-guessing that came from trying to meet standards that were designed to be impossible. As I drove away from the house where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to become whoever I wanted to be without the weight of family expectations and disappointed sighs and careful suggestions about how I could be better. I drove home through the quiet Christmas night, my mind surprisingly clear despite everything that had just happened. The familiar streets of Millbrook looked different somehow, as if I was seeing them for the first time, without the filter of childhood memories and family obligations. The Christmas decorations that had seemed magical earlier now looked like stage dressing for performances that everyone was too polite to acknowledge. When I got back to my apartment above Henderson's Bakery, I sat in my car for a few minutes looking up at the windows of my small home. The lights were off, and from the outside it looked lonely and humble compared to the grand family home I'd just left. But as I climbed the narrow stairs to my front door, I realized something profound. This small space was the first place I'd ever lived that was completely my own, free from the weight of other people's expectations and judgments. Inside my apartment felt like a sanctuary. It was tiny, yes, and it smelled perpetually of cinnamon and fresh bread from the bakery below. But it was honest. There were no family photos full of forced smiles, no expensive furniture bought to impress visitors, no careful arrangements designed to hide dysfunction behind beautiful facades. I sat on my small couch and looked around at my humble possessions. The secondhand furniture I'd bought with my own money, the books I'd been slowly collecting, the small Christmas tree I'd decorated with simple ornaments from the dollar store. None of it was impressive by my family's standards, but all of it was real. My phone started ringing around 10 o'clock. First it was Dennis, then Dad, then even Uncle Roger. I let them all go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear their apologies, their explanations, their attempts to minimize what had happened or convince me that somehow I was overreacting to being publicly humiliated at Christmas dinner. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my small window watching the snow fall on the quiet street below. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt truly peaceful. The constant anxiety about whether I was disappointing my family was gone, replaced by the simple certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. The next morning, Christmas Day, I woke up with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since before my marriage fell apart. Instead of spending the day fielding phone calls from family members or wallowing in self-pity, I decided to do something that would honor the person I was trying to become. I called the local homeless shelter and asked if they needed volunteers for Christmas Day meal service. The woman who answered the phone sounded surprised but grateful, and within an hour I was standing in the kitchen of the Millbrook Community Center, helping to prepare Christmas dinner for people who had nowhere else to go. The other volunteers were a mixture of ages and backgrounds, but they all shared something that had been completely missing from my family's Christmas table: genuine kindness and acceptance. No one asked about my job or my relationship status or my future plans. No one compared me to anyone else or suggested ways I could be living my life differently. Instead, I found myself working alongside people who were there simply because they wanted to help. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who had been volunteering at the shelter for 15 years. There was James, a local mechanic who brought his teenage daughter with him every Christmas to help serve meals. There was Father Rodriguez from the Catholic Church, who somehow managed to make everyone feel welcome regardless of their faith or background. As we prepared plates of turkey and mashed potatoes and green beans, I realized that this was what I'd been searching for all along, a sense of purpose that came from contributing to something larger than myself rather than from meeting other people's expectations of what my life should look like. The people we served were grateful in a way that touched my heart. Many of them were families who had fallen on hard times, not so different from my own situation after my divorce. Others were elderly people who had no family nearby, or individuals struggling with mental health issues or addiction. But none of them treated me like I was damaged goods or a disappointment. None of them laughed at my struggles or suggested that my problems were the result of character flaws. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but happier than I'd been in months. As we cleaned up the kitchen and put away the leftover food, Margaret asked if I'd be interested in helping with their regular weekly meal service. "We're always looking for reliable volunteers," she said with a warm smile. "You have a natural way with people and you work hard. Those are the qualities we value most here." It was such a simple compliment, but it meant more to me than all the conditional approval I'd spent years trying to earn from my family. Here was someone who saw value in who I was, not in what I could achieve or accomplish or acquire. I drove home that evening feeling like I'd finally found my place in the world. It wasn't the place my family had envisioned for me with the impressive career and the successful marriage and the house in the right neighborhood. But it was real and it was mine, and it was built on a foundation of authenticity rather than pretense. Over the following weeks, the aftermath of Christmas dinner continued to unfold. Dennis called several times eventually, leaving a voicemail that surprised me with its sincerity. He apologized for his behavior and admitted that he'd been struggling with doubts about his engagement and his life choices, but had been too afraid to be honest about his feelings. Patricia, according to Dennis, had postponed their wedding indefinitely, while she processed what she'd learned about him and his family. The fairy tale romance that had looked so perfect from the outside was apparently much more complicated when examined honestly. Dad sent a letter written in his careful handwriting, acknowledging his drinking problem from years ago, and apologizing for never addressing how it had affected me. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize his behavior, which meant more to me than any grand gesture could have. Mom's response was more complicated. She called repeatedly, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, sometimes trying to convince me that she'd been acting out of love and concern. She seemed unable to understand that her intentions didn't matter when her actions had been so hurtful. As winter turned to spring, I found myself building a life that was completely different from anything I'd ever imagined, but somehow perfectly suited to who I was becoming. The new job in Dayton had worked out even better than I'd hoped. My supervisor appreciated my work ethic and creativity, and I was quickly given more responsibility and autonomy than I'd ever had before. More importantly, I was building relationships with people who valued authenticity over achievement. My volunteer work at the shelter had led to friendships with people from all walks of life, united by a shared commitment to helping others, rather than competing with each other. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who helped me understand the dynamics that had shaped my family relationships and my own sense of self-worth. Through our sessions, I began to see how years of conditional love and constant criticism had taught me to doubt my own perceptions and accept treatment that no one should have to tolerate. Family dysfunction often creates a scapegoat, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. One person becomes the repository for all the family's problems and shame, allowing everyone else to feel better about themselves by comparison. Breaking free from that role requires enormous courage because it means giving up the hope that you can somehow earn their approval by being perfect enough. The insight was both painful and liberating. It explained so much about my family's dynamics and helped me understand that their treatment of me had never really been about my failures or shortcomings. It had been about their need to have someone to blame for their own disappointments and unmet expectations. Spring also brought an unexpected development in my personal life. Through my volunteer work, I'd met Harold, a high school English teacher, who helped coordinate the shelter's literacy program. He was nothing like the men my family would have chosen for me, no impressive job title or prestigious connections. But he was kind and funny and genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings, not just my potential to enhance his own image. Harold had been through his own struggles, including a difficult divorce from someone who had tried to change everything about him. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect, rather than passion and promises. We took long walks through the park, discussing books and ideas and dreams that had nothing to do with impressing other people. "You're the most authentic person I've ever met," he told me one evening as we sat on a bench watching the sunset over the lake. "You're not trying to be anyone other than who you are, and that's incredibly rare and beautiful." It was such a different kind of compliment from the ones I'd grown up hearing. Instead of praising me for achievements or appearances, he was celebrating my character, my willingness to be vulnerable and honest about my struggles and growth. By summer, I had moved into a larger apartment still in Millbrook, but in a complex that felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived. I had a job I enjoyed, meaningful volunteer work, genuine friendships, and a romantic relationship based on mutual respect and authentic connection. Most surprisingly, I found that I rarely thought about my family's approval anymore. The constant anxiety about whether I was disappointing them had been replaced by a deep sense of peace that came from living according to my own values, rather than their expectations. Dennis and I had begun to rebuild our relationship slowly and carefully. He had ended his engagement to Patricia, a decision that had been difficult but ultimately honest. He was in therapy too, working on understanding his own role in our family's dysfunction and learning to make choices based on his own needs rather than external pressures. "I envied you," he admitted during one of our coffee conversations. "Even when everyone was criticizing you, part of me envied your courage to just be yourself. I've spent my whole life trying to be who everyone else wanted me to be, and I have no idea who I actually am underneath all those expectations." It was a conversation I never thought we'd have, and it gave me hope that our relationship could be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than competition and comparison. Dad and I were also slowly finding our way back to each other. He had started attending AA meetings and was working on making amends for the ways his drinking had affected our family. Our conversations were awkward at first, but gradually became more open and authentic. Mom remained the most complicated relationship. She seemed unable to move past her need to be right about the Christmas dinner confrontation, alternating between apologies and justifications in a way that made real reconciliation impossible. I had learned to love her from a distance, protecting myself from her need to control and criticize while still honoring the positive aspects of our shared history. One year after that devastating Christmas dinner, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed. I was no longer the anxious, people-pleasing woman who had desperately sought approval from people who were incapable of giving it unconditionally. Instead, I had become someone who knew her own worth, independent of external validation. The lesson I learned that night, delivered in the cruelest possible way, was ultimately the most valuable gift I could have received: the understanding that being ashamed by people who should love you says everything about them and nothing about you. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable other people's dysfunction, even when that refusal comes at great personal cost. I learned that authenticity is more valuable than approval, and that building a life based on your own values is more rewarding than achieving success according to someone else's definition. Most importantly, I learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about the people who see you clearly, love you anyway, and support your growth rather than demanding your compliance. Some of those people might share your DNA, but many of them will be the chosen family you create through shared values and mutual respect. As I sat in my comfortable apartment surrounded by friends who celebrated my authentic self rather than demanding a performance, I realized that my mother had been right about one thing: I had been ashamed of myself for years. But not for the reasons she thought. I had been ashamed of my willingness to accept treatment. I didn't deserve my eagerness to seek approval from people who used love as a weapon, my failure to stand up for myself when it mattered most. Now I felt proud of the woman I'd become through surviving that shame and choosing something better. Proud of my small apartment that reflected my values rather than my income. Proud of my work that made a difference in people's lives, rather than just impressing observers. Proud of my relationships that were built on authenticity rather than convenience. That Christmas dinner was the worst and best thing that ever happened to me. It destroyed my illusions about unconditional family love, but it freed me to build something real and lasting in its place. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most give us the greatest gifts not through their intentions, but through their willingness to show us exactly who they are when the masks come off. I learned that being authentic in a world that rewards pretense is both the hardest and most rewarding choice you can make. And I learned that the people worth having in your life are the ones who love you not despite your struggles, but because of your courage in facing them honestly. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed how you see your family relationships? Drop a comment below and share your story. Sometimes the most painful experiences become our greatest teachers. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in difficult situations. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's approval. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Wishing you all the courage to live authentically and the wisdom to surround yourself with people who celebrate the real you.